Welcome to you all to the very first session of the new book forum, Science, Medicine, Environment. We're so grateful that you could join us. My name is Lisa Haushofer. I'm a senior research associate at the chair for the history of medicine at the University of Zurich. And together with Dr. Monique Wulz and Dr. Niels Güttler, who are also here, I'm one of the initiators and organizers of this event. This is a new event, so please be patient with us as we still find our feet. The idea for this emerged very much out of our present pandemic moment in which we find ourselves both more cut off from each other and from the usual events and gatherings that connect our fields, and at the same time with opportunities to connect in entirely new ways. And the new book forum is really a reflection of both of these developments. So we hope it can provide a platform to the fabulous new books in our fields that would normally be showcased at traditional conferences and talks, and also to allow students and early career scholars to connect with the authors of these books and with each other across distances that would normally have been difficult to bridge. The forum is generously funded by the Center for the History of Knowledge at the ETH in Zurich, but it is very much also a trans-institutional and transdisciplinary endeavor. It's organized by early career scholars in a number of connected fields: the histories of knowledge, medicine, science and environment, science studies, global history and modern history at the University of Zurich and the ETH. So it's very much a Swiss production, but one we hope that will connect our local community here with all of you, and all of you hopefully with each other. So even if we had tried, I think we couldn't have come up with a more perfect book to kick off this first session of the new book forum than Professor Suman Seth's Difference and Disease, Medicine, Race, and the 18th Century British Empire. Few other books combine the histories of science, medicine, and environment in the profound and sophisticated way as this book does. Few other books push forward the theoretical stakes of our fields in quite the same way. And few other books speak so poignantly to our times and to the urgent questions highlighted by this moment of epidemic disease and anti-racist reckoning. And we also couldn't have come up with a more perfect scholar to introduce its author and to co-host this session than my colleague Monique Ligtenberg. But before I introduce Monique and hand it over to her, just a few words about today's format. So the session will be divided into two parts. The first part is a panel discussion in which myself and Monique will talk with Suman and introduce some of the central aspects of the book. And then the second part will be an open discussion moderated by Monique Wulz, in which we invite all of you to ask questions. Please either type your questions in the chat, or if you prefer asking your question in person, just type a question mark in the chat and we will call on you to ask your question. The session is officially an hour long, but Suman has kindly agreed to stick around for a little bit after we close and chat with you in a more informal manner. So now allow me to introduce Monique Ligtenberg. Monique is a doctoral candidate at the Chair of History of the Modern Worlds and the Center for the History of Knowledge at the ETH Zurich. She holds a Master in History and Philosophy of Knowledge from the ETH. Her doctoral dissertation is entitled Medicine, Masculinities and Colonial Warfare, a Trans-Imperial History of German-Speaking Physicians in the Dutch East Indies. And it examines networks of colonial and scientific knowledge production spanning German-speaking Europe, the Netherlands, and the Dutch East Indies. Monique, take it away.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa, for your kind introduction. And it is now my honor to introduce today's very special guest, Professor Suman Seth. Professor Seth holds a BSc in Physics from the University of Sydney and an MA in General Studies from Princeton University, where he also obtained his PhD in the history of science with a dissertation on the history of theoretical physics in Imperial Germany. He is currently the Mary Underhill Knoll Professor of the History of Science in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. He has published widely on the history of medicine, race, colonialism, gender and science, as well as on the history of quantum theory. His first book, Crafting the Quantum, Arnold Sommerfeld and the Practice of Theory 1819 to 1926, published in 2010 with MIT Press, offered a cultural and intellectual history of pedagogical and scientific approaches in modern theoretical physics. He has guest edited a special issue of the journal Postcolonial Studies on science, colonialism, postcolonialism, and the focus section of the journal ISIS on relocating race. Until very recently, he served as the co-editor of the journal Osiris. And as we heard before, today he will be talking about his latest book, Difference and Disease, Medicine, Race and Locality in the 18th Century British Empire. And thank you so much, Suman, for being here today. It's really great to have you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel incredibly flattered and honored by your introductions and the chance to be here. Thank you.
So now, before opening up the discussion for questions from the audience, Lisa and I would like to get the conversation started with some questions of our own. As has already been briefly mentioned in the introduction, your early scholarly work was on quantum physics, in particular on the German physician Arnold Sommerfeld's research and teaching activities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Difference and Disease, on the other hand, covers not only a very different topic, the history of colonial medicine and race, but is also set in a very different time period, the early modern age of empire. So my question is pretty much how come? How did the idea for your recent book develop? And do you see any similarities to your earlier work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I will note that as an intellectual historian, part of my task is like constructing continuities in other people's thoughts. So I should have a line on this. So look, one way to think about this, I think, is to talk about the politics behind the different kinds of projects and to realize that there is a politics driving both of the books. So the first book was an attempt at a cultural history of physics. So the politics of that is to think about, something that most of us do, the social construction of scientific knowledge, something that I'm committed to in, of course, unpacking the history of race, but also in the history of physics. And it's to be noted that for a long time, maths and physics has been seen as the hard case in thinking about social construction of scientific knowledge. It's pretty easy to talk about the social construction of 19th century biology, or frankly, to prove that medicine in the 18th century is socially constructed. It's hard for that kind of political aim to do that for equations in 20th century quantum physics, but nonetheless, you need to be able to do that for the entire project to work, or else the response is, well, look, the thing is 19th century biology isn't really a science like 20th century physics is, and that's the explanation. So that's the politics of that. I think it's fairly clear where the politics of the recent project is, and I wanted to move towards something that had a more explicit kind of politics that goes with my kind of day-to-day thinking about politics. But then in terms of like how I got there, I was actually planning something much closer to what I knew something about. When I finished my first book, I was interested in doing something on early 20th century German colonialism. So I was actually interested in the German protectorate of Qingdao, which had an astronomical observatory as well, of course, as a brewery and other things. And so I was imagining kind of staying within the realm of what I'd largely done, but and I got interested in German colonialism generally, and I got hooked on a whole series of debates in the 1880s, right when the Germans start expanding their empire, about acclimatisation. It's a funny word in German. That double K is weird. It's clear it's coming from the French. And I got interested in where that word came from and tracking it backwards. Actually, Humboldt is almost certainly the source. The more German natural thing would be klimatisiert, for example. It's a direct move from German. Anyway, I realized that what was happening is a translation was happening from words like acclimate in French and seasoning in English. And so I got into this project by realizing that we didn't really have a deep understanding of seasoning in the British 18th century empire, and then, you know, the German dropped away. In terms of similarities, I will note that my Dr. Vater, when I gave a talk on this very early, noted immediately, he's a very good intellectual historian, that I'd really been interested in a physics of problems rather than a physics of principles, the kind of thing we associate with, say, Einstein or Planck. And he noted immediately that what I found my way to was a medicine of problems and not a medicine of principles. I'm really interested in that nitty-gritty, how arguments play out in a practical sense. So there's a way in which methodologically, there's a really tight connection in the way I read these sources and think about how minds work. So that's the best I can do in creating that continuity.
So one of the most unique and interesting things about your book is that in order to even ask the question that you want to be asking, it seems that you first needed to make a historiographical intervention of sorts into the way that the question has been framed previously. So in chapter 1, you provide a new reading of the multiplicity of interpretations of the Hippocratic text, Airs, Waters and Places, during the 16th and 17th centuries, and of the role of naturalist Hans Sloane and his natural history of Jamaica within these interpretations. So can you briefly tell us some of your key findings with regard to the intellectual landscape of Airs, Waters and Places during this period, and tell us how these findings prompted you to ask different questions about the emergence of conceptions of similarity and difference with regard to disease in the 18th century?
So I'm going to note in advance, these questions are brilliant and get to the heart of my book. So while I will try to be brief, they're actually really meaty questions. So I'm going to do my best. A quick summary. I don't know if everybody knows Airs, Waters and Places. So let me begin. It's a text. It's ascribed to Hippocrates. And the way it works is Hippocrates says, look, a doctor who's going to a new city needs to pay attention to its situation, the food and drink that its inhabitants eat, and the air in which they live. And basically this text is saying, look, it's radically different. Even two cities basically a mile apart, if they face in different directions, if the water goes over stony ground rather than muddy ground, what you're going to have is different characteristic diseases in those two cities, even with a difference of a mile. Different kinds of people. So it's been read as a, description of race. I think that's a bad word, but nonetheless. And also in the larger kind of logic of the text, different political systems. So it's a kind of explicitly political text. The latter part of it juxtaposes Europe and Asia, which really means Persia, and essentially makes a climatic argument for why you have different political systems in those places, and essentially why the Greeks have beaten the Persians. That's one of the standard ways of reading this text. Now, one way to read that is to say, oh, look, everywhere you go, every disease is going to be different. And there is a historiographical tradition based in essence on a single quote from Hans Sloane, which reads this exactly this way. And so Sloane is headed to Jamaica, and he writes in the book that he eventually publishes, look, I was talking to people and people said, oh, the diseases there are going to be completely different to everything that you know. So none of the knowledge that you have already made in the universities of Europe will apply there. And then Sloane says, but actually, I found that all the knowledge that I had worked brilliantly there, so I was just fine. I'm going to talk about why that matters socio-politically or socio-disciplinarily in a second, but we should back up to the fact that that's a weird reading of Airs, Waters and Places. It's not actually the way most people read it. Because if Airs, Waters and Places says there's multiple differences between places, what it does not say is when you go to a new city, you won't recognize any of the diseases. in essence, what it's doing is setting up multiple similitudes as well as multiple differences. So one way to read it is, if you go to a city in a cold place, you're going to find a lot more diseases that you associate with winter in the warm place where you live. They're not going to be new. They're just going to be a lot more winter diseases. And indeed, the way most people understood diseases in Jamaica, say, were, well, it's always summer there, so you're going to get lots and lots of summer diseases and not very many winter diseases. No one that I can find said, if you go to Jamaica, you're not going to see any diseases that you recognize and they're all going to be new. The reason I think that scholars today have become obsessed with that is that's kind of the way people read tropical diseases today, right? There are a whole bunch of diseases distinctive to the tropics that we don't know in, say, Zurich, right? But that's not how people understand the world in the 18th century. So indeed, the argument is, actually, you're going to see lots of things that you're familiar to. And again, there's as many similitudes as differences. So even Sloan says things like, well, look, yeah, Jamaica's hot. Montpellier is also hot, and we would expect the same diseases in Jamaica that we see in Montpellier. Go up a mountain in Jamaica and it's cool, and then you'll expect the same diseases in that location, in that microclimate, that you would see elsewhere. So now, what's Sloan up to then? Given that most people, I don't believe actually that he had this argument, that so many people said to him, oh, everything's going to be different there. So what's the argument about? The argument, I think, is a socio-disciplinary one. It's about who should be an expert in these places. If the diseases of Jamaica are entirely distinctive to that place, then doctors or medical men with experience in that place are your experts. Anyone who's been there for 20 years, they're the expert. And Hans Sloane, whatever his degrees in Europe, knows nothing. But Sloane is arguing the opposite. Actually, all of my training in Europe is exactly what we need, because that broad understanding is what we're going to have. And he has basically precisely that fight when he gets to Jamaica. So I think there's a problem sometimes when intellectual historians read phrases just straight or literally without realizing that there's a rhetorical point to everyone thinks this, but I think that. And in fact, we should be reading for precisely what's going on there. So yeah, that's the kind of thing. And then I should just note that Airs, Waters and Places is the go-to text through the 18th century. One of my guys in the 1720s begins his text on the diseases of Barbados with 30 lines in Latin from Airs, Waters and Places. So it's the kind of referential way of thinking these things through.
Thank you so much, Suman. One disease that plays a particularly central role in your book is the notion of seasoning sickness, or an illness that develops upon arrival in a different geographical location. So, for example, Europeans newly arriving in the West Indies. And maybe you could say a little bit more about how this concept changed over the period you have studied, and how that change in turn reflected important shifts in the relationship between place, disease, and the British Empire more broadly. And maybe also, as a historian of 19th century colonial medicine, I'm also very curious about the precise difference between seasoning and acclimatizing.
Yeah, great questions. And as I noted kind of in an earlier answer, seasoning is the heart of the book. It's actually how I got into this. And I spent my time looking for texts that talked about seasoning, but not, of course, in the sense of spices, but seasoning sickness, although the words are related. So it's actually, we can go back to Airs, Waters and Places to note an immediate difference here, and one that's kind of crucial and fascinating. So Airs, Waters and Places is really about the doctor moving to other places and the patients, so to speak, being locked in place. So it's the diseases of given places, right? But in the Age of Empire, you've got a radically different kind of question, which is people who have diseases of one place, Europe, moving en masse to a very different place, right? So people going from London to Jamaica. And in essence, the question, you've got two questions, right? One, explain why it is that when you go from London to Jamaica, you get really sick. And then two, why, if you survive that sickness, do you never really get that sick again? And the answer that they give is in terms of seasoning, that what happens is that after a seasoning sickness, you become seasoned to the climate. Now, what's the mechanism there? The way to think of this, again, Hippocratic or Galenic terms, in London, you have, at given seasons, a certain humoral balance, right? One appropriate to the climate that you're in and the temperature that you're in. People who live in Jamaica have a different humoral balance, again, appropriate to the season and the place that they're in. If you now move fairly quickly from one humoral balance to another humoral balance, your body has to make a sudden switch from one to the other, and that's the seasoning sickness, right? That's why you get sick. There's a debate actually about whether you need the seasoning sickness, like whether it's the mechanism by which your body makes the shift, or whether it's merely a symptom of stuff that's already happening. And so there's a debate about whether to stop the seasoning sickness or to let it go because it's necessary. So that's the kind of first thing in humoral theory. Then with Boerhaave and the shift towards the beginning of the 18th century, you get something that's medical theory much more in terms of fluids and fibers. There you start getting explanations in terms of how the blood pumps much harder in hot climates. So you need to let blood out of your veins so it doesn't pump so hard. Think of a tea kettle. And also that the fibers in warm climates sag like the strings of a stringed instrument. And again, you have to go from taut fibers and sluggish blood to lax fibers and pumping blood. And again, that causes a seasoning that in order to become seasoned, you go through an illness. I can talk about this endlessly because it does run through the book, but I will answer the seasoning versus acclimatization question because this is actually one of the things that fascinates me most at the moment. One of the things to think about is what things are associated with seasoning or acclimatization outside of medicine. So in English, you season multiple things. You talk about seasoned soldiers, seasoned courtiers in Shakespeare, but in terms of objects, you season metal. So when you get a new wok or a new cast iron pan, you need to season it by heating it up and rubbing oil on it till it smokes. You season wood, like wood that's just been cut. If you try and burn it, smokes. So you need to dry it out so it burns properly. Growing up in Australia, I needed to season my cricket bat. So you rub it with linseed oil and smack it with a cricket ball, right? So it's ready for its use. Note those weird kinds of things that are being included. Metals, wood, people. And note that that basically accords to animals, vegetables, minerals. It's the kingdoms of natural history, right? Now think about what you acclimatize. You don't acclimatize metal in English. And you don't acclimatize dead wood. You acclimatize living things. You acclimatize people. You acclimatize plants, living plants, and you acclimatize animals. So to me, that shift from seasoning to acclimatization, though they're largely synonyms in medicine, outside of medicine, they're the perfect analog to what Foucault notes is the biggest shift from the 18th century to the 19th century, which is the shift from natural history to biology. Acclimatization is a science of life, whereas seasoning doesn't make that distinction between living things and dead things. Metal counts, dead wood counts. So though they're largely synonyms, especially in the early 19th century, they kind of drift apart more and more throughout the 19th century, particularly in terms of how you can move from claims made about humans to claims made about other kinds of things. So yeah, this is one of my obsessions right now, is in fact, because in English, that word acclimatization really takes hold 1830s. Acclimaté in French turns up importantly in the Encyclopédie Diderot's encyclopedia. Tudy is the one who basically uses it in an article about naturalization, which is another fascinating book.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to ask one more question, but I'm just going to ask our audience to get thinking about questions because we'll open it up to the audience after this question. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat or type a question mark into the chat. So Suman, having explored the relationship between place, climate, and disease in the first part of the book, you then connect your insights to the notion of race in our modern sense of the term, and you pose the question, when did a conception of essential racial difference emerge and replace explanations of disease as primarily about place, in which race is merely a kind of a consequence of climate? And the key strategy that you employ in your answer to this question is to invite us to focus on what you call race medicine and not only race science. So can you briefly explain what you mean by race medicine and how a focus on race medicine as opposed to race science changes our understanding of the emergence of race as a category in explanations of disease?
Yeah, so this is where we get most explicitly to my contemporary political concerns, right? Because right now, in the last 20 years, race is back, right? You can see it everywhere in all kinds of discourses, but the place where it really manifests in a kind of natural scientific register is in medicine, right? So you get all kinds of arguments. David Reich wrote this piece in the New York Times, but it's everywhere, which say things like, look, race is a meaningful category. Ashkenazi Jews are X% more likely to develop breast cancer than other certain races. African Americans are X% more likely because of their genetics to develop, I don't know, heart disease than Euro Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got, after the kind of 1970s said, look, race is a meaningless category in science, you've now got a whole bunch of people arguing, no, it's super meaningful and medicine is where it matters. So the people who make that argument are, of course, well aware of a long history of race science. And the way that they kind of make their case with that in mind is, wait, that was about science. That was like measuring skulls and crazy stuff like this. This is medicine. It's about caring for people. It's a very new way of thinking about this. And thinking about race and medicine means that you can't call me a eugenicist or anything like that because this is a new thing. And my first response is no. In fact, race and medicine is the main game. If you start with Hippocrates and read forward, the way that most people thinking in naturalistic terms about human physical difference in these terms is thinking through airs, waters, and places, and is thinking about this in medical terms. So I would say that it's actually, I mean, to be controversial, there's a weird moment from 1750 to say 1950 where it's race science is the main game, but otherwise, really the history that we should be thinking about, even through that period, is race and medicine. Now, what difference does it make? Well, it gets us looking at things not like racialized anatomy, skulls, bones, and so on, which is the kind of heart of race science, but racialized pathologies. So what kinds of diseases are characteristic of certain races, which is absolutely the discourse running through all of this period and really gets a point put on it in the 18th century and the 19th century, and is exactly the discourse that we see today. So race medicine, I'm interested in this question: when do people start saying the reason that Black people get these certain diseases is because they're Black? And that is very recent, like 1750s. You really don't see it before that. Doctors in, say, the West Indies note that Black slaves, for example, get diseases that are different to white people in Jamaica. But their explanation is, well, look, they are fed terrible food, they have horrible accommodations and terrible clothes. Yes, Black slaves have different diseases to white people, but that's because they're slaves, not because they're Black. And it's a radical shift towards what we would recognize today as the argument, which is, no, the reason that Black people get disproportionate numbers of certain diseases is because of something inherent to their race, not because of what they're eating, where they're living, and so on and so forth. So those are the kinds of stakes in this question, and the very contemporary kinds of stakes for this question, and why I care about it in a sense so much. I mean, I care about it intellectually, but the politics of that, I think, really needs to be emphasized more strongly, so that people making those arguments today have to wrestle with the fact that exactly those arguments were made on slave plantations, or exactly similar arguments were made on slave plantations in the 18th century and throughout the 19th century.
Yeah, thank you so much for these insights in your book, in your work, and also in your current reflection on this topic. And I know that Lisa and Monique, it was hard for them to cut down the number of questions because they have so many questions for you and for your work. But we decided to at that point also to open the floor for discussion and invite all the participants also to ask their questions related to their interests. So we have some 25 more minutes for that, and I would suggest that either you put a question mark in the chat so I can see that you have a question, or you write your question, and so I would read it out then.
So it looks like we already have 3 people lined up for questions. So the first question comes from Sebastian Fonseca. Sebastian, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Is the sound on? Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Yes, Suman, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. The book was absolutely fascinating. Loved it. I am not a historian myself. I am a physician that's now working in a very transdisciplinary world, but I found all the insights that you brought very, very interesting. Now, I wanted, obviously there are many questions that I would like to ask, but one in particular that really caught my attention is that in the introduction in particular, you, in a very interesting way, point out a bit of a contrast between the post-colonial science studies, how they're dealing with research and empirical questions, and the other side, which is the colonial studies. You mentioned here 2 authors, Kapil Rush and Sujit Sivasundaram. You kind of put them in contrast to each other. You speak of how there are boundaries that are being blurred and how dichotomies that are being constructed between the periphery and the center through your research seems to not be so drastic, so extreme, to the point that they should be speaking to each other. Their methods between the post-colonial sciences and the colonial sciences should be speaking to each other. And I wanted to ask if, it's only mentioned in passing in page 10 in the introduction. I wanted to know a bit more about your thoughts on that, and maybe if I can share a bit more. I work in Latin American social medicine. A lot of what we do is very much grounded in this tendency to create dichotomies between the center and the periphery. And I'm wrestling with that tension of having that dichotomy or those boundaries being very productive in the way that they speak and the way that they frame their questions and stuff, but also very stifling in trying to go forward with the other questions that you pose in global health. And that's why I just wanted to also just use the book and everything that you bring in to hear a bit more about that difference between the two and how you see it played out, just kind of going forward in the contribution that you're making. So yeah, thank you, Suman.
Oh, so that's a fantastic question. So I have an article dedicated to this in Radical History Review. I have an article basically on post-colonial science studies and its relationship to colonial history, where I basically pulled out a few paragraphs for this book. So there's a longer answer there. But to give kind of that version here, quickly in terms of the historiography or the theory. So you've got Edward Said, and the way that many people read Said is that there are these kind of big binaries, self and other, center, periphery, and so on. And that's the way a lot of people read post-colonial theory through kind of the 80s. But then basically from the 90s, you've got people like Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak who offer a very different reading of how this should work, which is not, in fact, in terms of binaries, but is in terms of hybridities, borrowings, and so on and so forth. So one of my critiques of a number of people within the history of science, Kapil Raja I respect enormously, but I don't like his position on this, is that they seem to be stuck in 1980 in their critique of post-colonial studies, because they keep saying things like, what we really need is to stop thinking in terms of binaries and start thinking in terms of hybridity and translation and so on, which is what post-colonial studies has been doing for the last 30 years. So it's a very weird critique. Let's do what you've been doing for the last 30 years. So I don't find that terribly meaningful as a critique. Now, I do, however, have a problem with a kind of emphasis now in a lot of colonial history of science, which is really focused on, because it's wary of those binaries, has really focused on people who blur those boundaries. So go-betweens, mediators, and so on, to show that the effect of those binaries wasn't absolute, which I think is very meaningful. But again, kind of politically, it bothers me a little bit, because those people who could serve as mediators and go-betweens were overwhelmingly the exception. And I think that there's a problem with emphasizing them all the time and then not talking about the ways that those binaries functioned in practice to bound people and to limit them. So to get at your question, yes, on the one hand, we should think about those binaries as actors categories, the way that colonial officials, for example, tried to impose those on people and lock them in place, even if they weren't always successful, because many people were indeed locked in place and died voiceless, locked in those places as slaves who never were able to mediate or go between. But I don't think we should treat them as analysts as if they're real and absolute. I think we should treat them as moves that people at the time tried to impose upon people. So then the aim of the book is, rather than saying, let's look at all the blurrings that some people were able to do, it's let's look at all the work that had to go into making those binaries seem absolute in the first place when we know that they weren't, and track how that changes over time. So it kind of, rather than going to, here's where they're in place, look how they're blurred, it goes, it's kind of Latourian. Let's go back to before the black box was closed and see how this gets set up in the first place. And if you track it forward from there, you never really believe that they were absolutes in that sense, because they never entirely work. They're changing even for imperial officials, let alone in their imposition as they try and get them to move. So that's what's going on. But the longer version of this, as I say, I wrote a whole article about this because it was bothering.
Next, we have Brad Bowman.
Hey, Brad.
Hello. So thanks. This is my second talk now on this book, and I feel well seasoned with its content. I recently finished a rather fascinating recent book called Sulfuric Utopias, which covers the advent and genealogy of sort of fumigation machines for transport ships. And it struck me that in a certain sense, fumigation is sort of the inverse of the putrefactive and seasoning paradigm. So if you can fumigate a ship on its arrival at the end of its journey, it eliminates its disease burden. It becomes less relevant whether diseases existed at the start of the journey, sort of in the tropics. So I'm wondering, how are your actors thinking about the movement of goods between the colony and metropole, the possibility of diseases returning from the tropics, and are there seeds in this earlier period of this kind of coming fumigatory paradigm? So thanks.
Wow, that's a super interesting question. Fumigation is not a word that they use, but they are obsessed with getting air moving. So there are all kinds of, there's a whole super interesting history of technology to be written properly. Some has already been written, which is about all these air moving devices that they try and, you imagine sailors in the holds, there's very little air. If they're in areas that are below the sea line, they can't even open the windows. So you can imagine how gross it is down there. And so there are all these kind of things about pumping bellows of air through, lighting fires so that you can move things through. And that is indeed about trying to get that putrefactive air moved out. Movement of goods. So this is then one of the central questions for this, and then just afterwards in the early 19th century, which is a question about whether this stuff is contagious or not. So for the most part, they don't think most diseases are contagious, in part because they have a different understanding of what we would understand contagion to be. So the Latin is basically con and then tagio for touch, right? So they have in mind the kind of paradigmatic illness is smallpox. You can stick a needle into a smallpox sore, get that gooey stuff that you can then see on your needle and scratch someone else and they will get smallpox, right? So that's what they have in mind as a model of contagion. And you will note that there are very few diseases that we would call contagious today, where you can take something that you can see and move it to something else. So there is a debate about, for example, whether yellow fever is contagious. And there are a couple of people who try and argue that yellow fever is like plague and plague is contagious. But for the most part, the argument is that this isn't about contagion, it's about place. So it's about putrefaction in place, which is why famously Benjamin Rush in 1793, trying to explain why you've now got yellow fever in Philadelphia, says, oh, look, there was this order of coffee, a massive order on the docks, which wasn't picked up, which rotted, and that's the cause, right? So they are worried about goods, and there's an extensive argument about whether quarantine is what you should be doing, which goes with a contagion argument. But kind of medically, for the most part, you don't get until the very end of the 18th century extensive arguments about most of these diseases being contagious, and therefore goods aren't the worry. The last thing I'll say, though, that question about things going back, you should note that people going back, having been seasoned in Jamaica, then face a re-seasoning in England. So a number of people note that they don't want to go back, right? They don't want to go through that again. And then the very last point, we should note that in that category of goods are, of course, people through the slave trade. And there is an extensive argument about the reason that yellow fever is now seen in Jamaica when it wasn't there before is because slaves have somehow brought it with them. And there you get a kind of abstractly contagionist argument that blames it on the slave trade for the development of certain diseases. So, great question.
Next, we have Lucas Müller.
Hi, thank you so much for this, for organizing this event and for this really interesting book, which I'm now really keen to read fully. And I wondered about challenges to this emergent and then quite for frame that then sticks around for many centuries on race and medicine, because on my work on the history of cancer, I observed, for example, in the early 20th century that people argued a lot against cancer being a racialized disease by making all kinds of comparisons similar to the ones you described, where doctors who live and really have experience in certain places should study the disease occurrence, and then you can make comparison and figure out things about the environment again. And so I wondered also if you have like then observed like challenges and alternative explanations to this increasingly racialized framework that you emerged.
Yes, so I mean, it's all tied up also with the history of race. So I'm sure you're thinking of Keith Wyler's book, How Cancer Crossed the Color Line, as one of the references there for the 20th century. Melbourne Tapper also has a fantastic book on the kind of 1950s. But part of what's going on here, so look, not all diseases are raced, of course. The vast majority of them in this period aren't. And you get a changing explanation for why they would be. So the standard kind of argument is, well, look, of course, Africans don't get yellow fever as much, people of African descent, because they're from a warm climate. Yellow fever is a warm climate disease. So they were seasoned to a warm climate in Africa. Then they're brought to a somewhat different but still warm climate in Jamaica or Barbados. So of course, since the difference is smaller, they're less likely to be sick than people coming from Northern Europe, where it's super cold and horrible all the time, to Jamaica, where it's warm and sunny. That's a much bigger difference. So of course, white people or Northern Europeans experience and have to go through a much more radical seasoning sickness. That said, it's worth noting that one standard kind of result is that 30% of slaves are said to die in the seasoning sickness. So a full 3 in 10 of every slaves brought out die due in those first years, they say, due to this seasoning sickness, and then they price it into the value of a slave. A seasoned slave is worth about 30% more in price than an unseasoned slave. So it's right in there. Through the 19th century, you start getting different arguments about this, which aren't about habituation anymore and are about innate qualities. And that one's then super interesting, right? Exactly, you can't dissect someone and see, oh, look, that's where they're immune to yellow fever. So they have these kind of arguments which claim it's about race, right? But that base this on statistical data, which could be interpreted in terms of a seasoning paradigm, but are no longer, right? But it's worth noting that these are all emerging out of, and this is what I'm obsessed with right now, statistics. So statistics as a word, 1751 in German first, the science of the state, statistics, and medical statistics, early 19th century. So Ian Hacking talks about the avalanche of printed numbers between 1820 and 1840. Military medical statistics are where this data starts becoming kind of real and objective. And you start getting, oh, look, all of these, the people in the West India regiments, so black people of African descent, are much more likely to get pulmonary complaints and much less likely to get yellow fever. And that increasingly is read as a racial difference rather than a difference of nativity or habituation, right? Race becomes the operative category. But they don't really have, for all the period that I've been studying, so up to 1870, they don't have a kind of etiological explanation, right? The humoral theory is gone and they can't find it in the dissection. So they're just like, it's some innate difference that we can't put our finger on. That is the reason. But one way it's then explained is if you take a polygenetic view, so the different races were created each in their different places, then you don't really need a different explanation, because we're not all related anyway. We're all different animals get different diseases. So then you're like, it's basically just a character of black people, like their dark skin, that they have this immunity. And then you can kind of not really have to explain why the difference. So it's actually super interesting to try and work out when they come up with any kind of etiological explanation for why there should be this difference. Genetics does it today, right?
Great, thanks. And then we have Niels Güttler.
Hi, and thanks for really an interesting discussion so far. So I think I just want to ask, because like the book series is called Science, Medicine, and Environment, and Lisa just said in the beginning, right, that your book's really like a great start for the series. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about the environmental part in your book, so how your story relates to environmental history, or more specifically to the history of environmentalism in the sciences. Because from what I took from your really like brilliant introduction is that there's of course a strong Hippocrates tradition that's really important for shaping race science, as you call it. And I wonder, so is there already kind of like, are there already, or is kind of this notion of environment in terms of Alexander von Humboldt or Humboldtian science coming into your story? And does it also shape this kind of race science power structure that you described? So I really would be interested in, yeah, if you could just add on that maybe.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it's pre-Humboldtian, although Humboldt was my way in a sense. So the word environment isn't really used. Climate is going to be the word here, but climate has a larger meaning than ours, or certainly even the original meaning. So climates originally were just latitudinal bands across the globe. So one idea, for example, was that there were 7 climates, right? So 7 regions that you could divide the world into. Part of what is going on here, and again, this is a kind of a Hippocratic tradition, is that somebody like Town, say in 1726, writing about the diseases of Barbados, is saying, look, this is where Barbados is latitudinally, but it doesn't have exactly the same diseases as everywhere else on that latitudinal line or in that band, because it's also an island and it's thickly covered with trees. And so it's an argument about place on the globe, but also kind of local place. So if there's sea air, that's going to have a different effect than dry air. And if you go up a mountain, that's going to be a different, right? So it's very attentive to what we would call local environmental conditions. And there's good work. Catherine Johnson has used the term microclimate to describe the logic. And again, it's a very airs, waters, and places kind of thing. Really a difference of a mile, if you do it in the right place, change from like plowed land to unplowed land. Again, radically different diseases. So if we could step away from actors' categories and like speak about it in our terms, it's a very richly environmental medicine that cares deeply about exactly your micro surroundings. Are you near a marsh? If you're near a marsh, you're going to get a whole bunch of miasmatic diseases, right? But they don't talk about it, in the ways that we would now. What's interesting, of course, is if we can jump a century forward to the germ theory, what the germ theory does is then take away these environmental kind of logics almost entirely. Don't really matter what's going on around you. It's about germs transferred between people. But this is all about the doctor really understanding local conditions. And that's, of course, what's at stake between Hans Sloane and the people that he's arguing with, because they're the ones who are like, dude, we know what's going on here. You just arrived. How the hell are you supposed to be grappling with this? To which Sloane says, yeah, it's basically the same as what's going on in England during the summer. Relax, I've got a degree from Oxford, so maybe you should sit back down. So yeah, it's a very rich thing, but it's interesting. I didn't read very much in environmental studies. It's funny, I got to the end of the book and then was like, I should really have been reading more broadly so that I could make these connections more clearly, because they're right there.
Great, thanks. And then we have one more question from Monique.
Yeah, so as our discussion is almost at the end, I thought I'd ask you about some kind of take-home message, in the sense that we already talked about how your book self-identifies as a post-colonial history of medicine. And what I know about post-colonialism is that there's also a very strong idea that certain categories that emerged in colonial settings continue to structure our world until today in some ways. So would you say that there are continuities of your findings that still influence the ways in which we think about place, race, and disease?
Yeah, absolutely, and depressingly. So that connection between race and medicine, I already talked about that kind of re-efflorescence, but we can get into the weeds here. So I've given this, versions of the book talk various places. One of the things that comes up all the time when I have people trained in medicine or nursing in the audience, a kind of substantial part of the book looks at, other people have written about this as well, the ways that Black people, people of African descent, are cast as feeling less pain than white people or people of European descent, that they are less sensitive, literally. Their senses and their nerves don't operate the same way. And when I present this stuff to nursing or doctors, that all of them start saying, yeah, well, okay, that's depressing, because 250 years later, there are masses of studies which note, for example, that African-American women in childbirth get given less pain medication than European-American women during childbirth, that Black people in general are given less pain medication than whites. And I had nursing professionals actually send me a section of their nursing handbook which said in black and white, oh, Black people feel less pain than white people. They have a higher pain threshold, right? So we have a very long history. And to me, what that is about is fundamentally a failure of medical empathy, of seeing this person's pain as just like my pain requires seeing this person as just like me. And if you don't, if you've been trained to not see this person as just like me, then that failure of empathy turns up in study after study after study, in failures to treat as well, and failures to do basic things like pain management. So there, the contemporary project, the project that I'm working on now, which is on the relationship, the kind of role that statistics plays in making race real, in a sense, real and objective in ways that it doesn't have to be, that you see all the time. I mean, I regularly throw up a slide, just Google race and COVID-19 and look at the studies that tell you stuff which could be ethnicity, could be race. They tend to throw both words up there and then not distinguish between them. The titles are often like COVID-19, race and ethnicity. And you're like, those are very different things. And your statistics aren't distinguishing between them at all. So maybe you should be a lot more careful before you start arguing that African Americans racially are more likely to get COVID-19 and die from it, rather than they have a much lower socioeconomic standard and have much lower standards of healthcare when they go to doctors, rather than implying somehow that this is biological. So yeah, I have a whole bunch of views on this. If we can we can cut the tape and then we can really get into it.
And on that note, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our official time. So if you have to leave, please do so. We will keep this line open a little bit, so you'll have a chance to chat to Suman afterwards. But for now, a huge thanks to all of you for coming, for your questions. Please keep in touch and check out our upcoming events in the next semester. And now please join me in thanking Suman Seth for a phenomenal discussion and a phenomenal book. Do go and read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This is awesome.